Okay, so let's get started here. This is chapter 7. Okay, we're going to kind of do things out of order. We're going to do chapter 7 today, and then we're going to do chapter 9 in your book after this chapter, and then we'll do 8 after chapter 9, but it doesn't really matter. So today we're going to talk about life under the old regime. Okay, this is the very beginning, like I said, of chapter 7, and what we're going to learn about what was life like before the French Revolution. Okay, so the French Revolution is obviously a very big deal. We'll get to it before Christmas, but at the same time, you need to know what life was like before the French Revolution, so that when the French Revolution actually happens, you can see how things drastically are going to change. Well, in some areas, they're really not going to drastically change. What stayed the same? Well, you guys will see. All right, so this is life under the old regime. Essential question 7.1. All right, what powers and privileges did European nobles possess, and how did they attempt to keep those powers? But at the same time, we're going to ask what rights did peasants possess, and what was their role in society? So what we are going to do is we're going to talk about both what was life like for the nobles, what was life like for the peasants, and we're going to talk about what their roles were and kind of how they lived. All right. Like I said, this is two separate things. This is two separate things, guys, and we combine them into one. Okay. So anyway, like I said, what powers and privileges did European nobles possess, and how did they attempt to keep those powers? And then number 2, what rights did peasants possess, and what was their role in society? And you might think, wait, peasants had rights? They did. All right, not a lot, but they did. So let's talk about that. Pause if you need to. Let's jump into it. All right, traditions. Tradition! That's from a play called Fiddler on the Roof. If you've never seen that, you won't get that joke I just made, so let's just move on. So let's talk about the old regime. So when you see, I'm sorry, I threw in a fancy word, ancien regime. That's French, ancien. If you add a T, it says ancient, and that's exactly what it means in French. The ancient regime, the ancien regime, the old regime, it's the same thing. So anytime you're talking about, and by the way, I doubt you will see the word ancien regime, but anytime you're talking about the old regime, it means life before the French Revolution. So obviously, like I said, the French Revolution is going to be a game changer. So we're going to learn about what life was like before. Well, absolute monarchies were the norm. All right, they were becoming the norm. And what was going on was absolute monarchies were changing old traditions. So you might think, well, what old traditions were absolute monarchies changing? Well, think about what the Stuarts tried to do in England. They tried to take power from the nobles and raise their own money, right? Think about how Cardinal Richelieu and the Bourbon kings of France took power away from the nobles. Think about the Hohenzollerns. They took power away from the nobles. Peter the Great, the Russians, they took power away from the boyars. Bottom line is, nobles are losing their power all over Europe because of absolute kings, and guess what? They want it back, all right? So, what traditions are nobles losing? Now, it really differs based on what country you live in. The further west you go, the more modern things are, and the further east you go towards Russia, the more backwards things get, and ancient and doing things the old way. Okay? But traditionally, nobles don't pay taxes. Okay? It's one of the things about being a noble is that you get out of paying taxes, which means that most taxes are on the most people that bear the burden or the brunt of the taxes are usually what are called burghers. You're going to see in France they're called bourgeoisie, which are basically wealthy, middle-class merchants. They're not noble because they can't own land, but they're not peasants. And of course, the peasants, they pay taxes too. So if you really look at it, that is one of the things that kings usually bribe the nobles with. Hey, if you do what I say, you don't have to pay taxes. Now, what are some other traditions? Well, if you're a peasant, one of the traditions that you have is you have the right to work on noble land, or what's called common land. You see, guys, if you're a peasant, you don't really own the land. As a matter of fact, you work on a lord's land, and you get to keep some of your crop and feed your family, and maybe even sell some of your crop. But some of your crop you have to give to the noble lords so they can do whatever with it. All right? But bottom line is you don't actually own the land that you work on. You work on somebody else's. But peasants have always had that right. Now you're going to see as we move through the chapter, peasants are going to slowly lose the right to work on the common lands, and they're going to be pissed, and some of them are going to rebel, and they're never successful. Peasants rebelling against nobles never work. Okay, so there's some traditions. Nobles don't pay taxes. Nobles get to control their own land. It's another thing that nobles get to do, guys, is they get to make up the rules for their own land. But you've seen absolute kings want to slowly take that power away, and they want everybody to do what the king wants them to do, correct? All right, pause if you need to. All right, so let's look at this map. This would be a map of an everyday land that a lord owns. So you see the lord's castle. Now, inside that castle wall is a village in and of itself, all right? It's like its own little city, all right? Those are the urban areas. Now, you see the village on the outside of the castle. So, yes, the lord controls the village technically, but like I said, the village is outside of the castle. They usually do their own thing, and this is where we talked about like witchcraft and witch hunts, and people wanted to extend their power over villages, right? So the villages does their own thing, and what you see is cultivated land. These are lands that all of the peasants from the town, they can go grow crops on. They've got their own little piece of land, and the Lord lets them grow crops on those lands, right? Okay? Now, once again, the peasants don't own the land. All right? There's also pasture, so if peasants want to raise sheep, there is pasture for raising sheep. Okay? But once again, guys, they don't own the land, the lords do. Does it make sense? I hope it does. Okay? All right, so the aristocracy, that's supposed to be highlighted yellow. I don't know why it's not. The aristocracy of Europe. So when you see the word aristocracy, it means nobility, okay? Aristocrat is a noble, all right? Those words are interchangeable. So if you see on a test or a primary source or whatever, and it's talking about the aristocracy, it's talking about the nobility. If it's talking about an aristocrat, it's talking about a noble, okay? All right, now, usually it's a very small percentage of the population. We'll get into specifics when we get into different revolutions like the French Revolution, but usually the nobles make up a very tiny part of the population, usually 1% or less, okay? So, but think about this. In many cases, 1% of the population own like half the land of a country, all right? In France, literally 2% of the population owned almost half the land in France, okay? So think about that, guys. Is that fair that a very tiny number of people own the most land and the most wealth? Probably you'd say no, right? Because the majority of people, like 98%, or usually like anywhere from 80 to 90% of the people of a country are peasants. And they don't own land or wealth, okay? So that's the aristocrats, usually very small, but they own most of the land and the wealth. Now let's talk about the British. All right, now British nobles are a little bit different. Actually, British nobles have a little system, it's called primogeniture. We're going to get into it in another chapter, so you'll see what's going on. But basically, the oldest son of a noble has the right to sit in parliament. So if you are a son of a noble, then someday, if you're the oldest son, you get to be a member of parliament or an MP, which means member of parliament. All right? Nobles got to levy. All right? Levy means pass a tax. So guys, get that in your mind. If you're going to levy a tax, you're going to pass a tax, okay? The British nobles got to levy taxes, but something unique about the British nobles is they actually paid taxes, unlike other countries. All right, now, British nobles also got to collect rent from their land, so they could charge their peasants rent, and they had control over their land. All right, so like I said, more modern countries are like Britain, and as you go east, it gets a little bit less modern, okay? They had direct control over local government, all right? So the people making choices in Great Britain are not its king, right? It's its nobles, which make up parliament. Do you guys remember that? We talked about the English Civil War and how the king tried to do his own thing, and parliament made it very clear by cutting off Charles I Stuart's head that they were in charge, right? And then with the Glorious Revolution, they put William and Mary on the throne, making it clear that, like I said, parliament's in charge. So the British noble have a lot of power and they have a lot of rights, but they also pay taxes, which is unique, all right? Because most nobles don't pay taxes in other countries. It's one of their privileges, okay? Pause if you need to. We're going to move on. All right, now, let's talk about the French nobles. Now, the French nobles are kind of divided into two separate groups, okay? One of the groups is called nobles of the sword. These are nobles that got title from military service. Now, when you see the word title, that usually means the title of a lord, all right, or a knight, or a noble, okay? So they got their nobility for doing something in the military. Maybe a great military leader wasn't born of the nobles, but he did something awesome in a battle, and the king granted him a title, all right? You are the Duke of whatever, or the Earl of whatever, okay? So they got title from the military service. Those are nobles of the sword. The other groups are called nobles of the robe. They got title from a couple things: government service or they bought their title. Now, do you guys remember how Louis XIV, the Bourbon kings would like bribe their nobles? Well, one of the things that the Bourbon kings would do is they would give titles to like maybe a bourgeoisie, which is the wealthy middle class, right? They're not nobles, but they've got a little bit of money like a merchant. They might say, hey, if you want to be a noble, you can buy a title. Now, what does the king get out of that? Money. All right. What does the bourgeoisie or the burgher get out of that? Well, they get a title and they get to own land. So nobles of the robe were a little bit different, and they were kind of looked down upon by nobles of the sword, who got their, nobility from military service and were generally older nobles. All right, so this new nobility, could buy its way in. All right, now think about how the older nobles would think about like a burgher or a bourgeoisie buying their nobility. They'd be like, oh, you're not even a real noble, right? Okay, so nobles in Versailles were a lot more wealthy and a lot more powerful than nobles in, say, Great Britain. Okay, well, more powerful, they had complete control over local government, right? But they didn't have any control over France because that was the king's job, right? Okay, so the nobles in Versailles were a lot more wealthy. Think about it. The king bribed them to enforce their will. The king let them live in Versailles, and be lavished with, luxuries and things, okay? So let's talk about the privileges of the French. Number one, they're all exempt from the main tax of France, which is called the taille, all right? So once again, very small percentage of the population, 2%, all right, less than 2%, and guys, they don't have to pay taxes, and they have half the wealth of the land, all right? So that means basically the entire tax burden of France comes from the bottom, all right, the poorest people. So it's no wonder when the French Revolution breaks out, it's one of the reasons why they're in so much debt. They only tax poor people. They don't tax the wealthy, right? Now, all of them are exempt from forced labor called corvée. Now, there's this thing where if the king would say, hey, guys, I want all my nobles we're going to build something right here, that's called forced labor. And in other countries, the king could enforce what are called corvées, which if you're a noble, you have to respond and you have to work for the king. Well, one of the privileges, you'd never had to do that, okay? So that's another thing, they got exempt from forced labor. All of the French nobles got local control, if you remember. They got to collect rents from peasants that lived on their land, all right? So if you see, the nobility in France are a little different than the ones in England because, for the most part, they don't pay the main tax of France, right? And remember, the people that make rules in England are the nobles, and in France, it's the king, right? He has all three powers of government. So remember, guys, that was kind of one of the ways that the king bribed the nobles. Hey, do what I say, and then you can have control over your own land. You get bribes, you get money, all that stuff, right? All right, pause if you need to. All right, now let's move further east, and let's go to Prussia, all right? The Hohenzollerns, all right? So Prussia is pretty much, the German states. They're usually poorer than Western nobles like the French and the English. And the Prussian Junkers, if you remember, one of their big things was they served in the military and they were very powerful. So it's kind of like military service kind of tied you to your nobility. And we learned about that with the Fredericks and the Williams and the Frederick Williams and all that stuff. All right? The Hohenzollern family. Okay? Now, in Prussia, some of the nobles were tax exempt, some of them weren't. It really kind of varied. All right? But there was some tax exemption. All right? All right, now let's move on to Russia. Now think about what we know about Russia under Peter the Great, okay? Nobles at one time kind of had power, but if you remember Peter the Great, when he tried to westernize Russia, remember he cut their beards, he built St. Petersburg, he says from now on you're going to do what I say, right? So under Peter the Great, remember with the table of ranks, basically your nobility is tied to your service. So if you're not a noble that does work or that works, hard for the government, then you are probably not going to be a very powerful noble, all right? Another thing is, remember, Peter the Great forced his nobles to live in St. Petersburg. So once again, that's nobles being forced to do something. All right, rather than in Louis XIV's France, nobles were bribed and did it voluntarily, or in England, where the nobles whooped the tail of the king and took over, right? Parliament, right? Okay, so did nobles fight back? Is there anything that they could do to fight back from losing power over, losing their privileges, okay? Well, nobles did try to preserve their power by doing, basically one of three things. A, they could try to make it harder to become noble. For instance, In France, a lot of French nobles tried to influence the king to stop selling titles because they felt it cheapened being a noble. Same thing happened in Parliament in Great Britain. They basically started passing laws making it harder to become a noble because they were tired of, like, burghers or bourgeoisie buying their nobility and, getting a title that way. That's one thing they could do. Another thing, if you had a strong parliament which only counted in England, then they could use the power to check they could use their parliament to check the power of the king. All right? But guys, that really only works in England because there is no really strong French parliament. There's no strong, really Prussian parliament, and there's no strong Russian parliament. So if you guys can imagine, that's not really an option for most nobles. All right? Now, another thing, they could rebel. But if you're England, you already rebelled and it was successful. If you are French, then why would you want to rebel? You get paid money not to rebel, and you get bribed to live in Versailles, and it's, a great life. If you're Russian, that rebellion, the Streltsy rebellion, guys, and even the boyars in some way were, kind of crushed. So nobody's really going to rise up unless it was England. That's the only one that really, tried to do that. So those are the way that nobles could fight back. But like I said, it doesn't really happen for a while, all right, in other countries, okay? And it's not the nobles that rebel. It's usually, you'll see. Okay, pause if you need to. We're moving on. All right, now, let's finish up with some peasants, all right? Finish up. Sounds like you're eating peasants for dinner. Let's finish up with some peasants. That'd be probably gross because, they don't bathe. You know what? Nobles didn't bathe very often either. It's kind of a thing. You put perfume on it and you had that stank. Anyway, guys, I don't know what I'm talking about. Let's talk about peasants. All right. So you might see the word serfs or peasants. What do they mean? Well, peasants are usually in Western Europe, and they usually had the privilege to move to different lands or live under different nobles. Like, let's say you were a peasant and you were kind of struggling in one area. You might be able to pack up your family and move to a different area. That was the freedom that you had in Western Europe. Okay, now, a serf would be most likely tied to the land or a noble. Do you guys remember we talked about the Hohenzollerns, and one of the things that they gave to their nobles was the power to control their serfs? So, let's say a peasant family in Germany is struggling and they want to leave. Well, that means also that the noble will lose labor, so they can say no. So a serf is more tied to the land, and it's more specific to, like, Eastern Europe, like maybe Prussia, Russia, places like that. Maybe some parts of the what's left of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay? So that's the difference. All right, now let's talk about their role in society. They were laborers. They were farmers. Some of them were tradesmen. If they could learn a trade, then they would be able to, become like a bourgeoisie, like a wealthy merchant or something like that. But this is typically what the role of peasants were. They were the workers at the bottom, all right? They paid the most taxes. Okay, well, them and the bourgeoisie. But remember, the majority of the tax burden was not on the nobles in Europe. It was on the people at the bottom. Okay, so they don't have a lot, and they're getting taxed with what they do have. So you can imagine it was kind of a struggle, right? Now, sometimes, and in some places like England, a merchant might be able to buy land. Okay, so that's what I mean by sometimes owned land, all right? But most of the time, they either rented the land or they simply worked on the land, okay? So don't get this idea that if a peasant got enough money, they could just go buy land. That could only happen maybe at best in England, all right? Because other people guarded land ownership with nobility, like you're not a real noble unless you own land, right? So most peasants either rented land or they just worked on the land, okay? Rights. Now, you might think, what rights did they have? They're peasants. Well, they did have some rights. For instance, in Western Europe, they had the right to work on common land. All right, remember, that's the land owned by the nobles, and they have a right to work on it. They don't own it, but they grow crops. They might tend their sheep or their goats or chickens or whatever it is that they have. All right, so they do have the right to work on common land. Okay. Now, another thing they have the right to do is if they are wronged, they have the right to go to a local court in a village or on the land of a noble and get what they would consider justice. Okay? All right, so those are rights that the peasant had. They could appeal problems and they could work on the common land. Now, you're going to see a lot of rebellions that happen in the next couple chapters are going to be because some of these rights get taken away. All right, like the right to the common land is going to get taken away in the next chapter or two. And peasants are going to rebel. Why are they rebelling? They're not trying to overthrow society. They're literally just rebelling because they lost a right that they want back. Okay? So those are peasant rights. Pause if you need to. Oh, wait. My bad. One more. Eastern Europe, Russia. When I talk about rights, you say, yeah, right, because Russian slaves had no right. Or Russian serfs basically had no rights. They were basically slaves. They were tied to the owner of the land, and they could not leave. Entire families were tied to an owner of land. So if you had kids and your kids had kids, you were all going to live on that noble's land. You couldn't move, all right? Because Peter the Great also granted his nobles control over their serfs, all right? So, Russian rights, yeah, right. Pause if you need to. All right, peasant revolts. They did happen, and they're never successful. Okay, so, like I said, not common because peasants don't have weapons, they don't have armor, they don't have horses like cavalry, they don't have gunpowder. Peasants are going to come at you with a pitchfork or, some kind of tool because that's all they've got, right? So it's not common. Let me give you an example. There was Pugachev's rebellion in Russia. It happened between 1773 and 1775. All right, what was it about? Well, guys, you can imagine Russian peasants are pretty bad off. They're slaves. They don't have the right to move to other lands. So it was led by this peasant named Emelian Pugachev. Emelian Pugachev. How about this accent for Russia? Yes? You know it's good. All right, so it was a Russian peasant rebellion due to heavy taxes and harsh treatment. All right, like I said, who faces the brunt of taxes? It's the bottom of Europe, okay, the peasants, because most nobles get exempt from paying taxes. Harsh treatment means basically, like I said, if you were a serf in Russia, you couldn't move from one place to another. You pretty much had to stay under that leader, under that lord, for your life and the life of your kids and your grandkids. You're not moving anywhere. All right. So why did it happen? That's why. Did it work? Oh, of course not. All right. Remember, peasants don't have guns, even though this rebellion makes it look like, wait, that actually would be the nobles that are putting it down. There's Pugachev in the background. All right. Yeah, he doesn't have any weapons. Anyway, now, he tried to actually end serfdom and give peasants land. You're going to see, guys, this is the common theme in Russia especially, all right, that he was trying to say, hey, I'm going to rebel. I'm going to get all these peasants following me. We're going to win, and we're going to get rid of serfdom. We're going to have the right to own our own land. Yeah, right. Okay, remember, Russian rights equals yeah, right. Okay, like, yeah, right. It's not going to happen. All right? All right, now, let's talk about English game laws, all right? You might see these somewhere. So, what is game? Well, game means hunted animals. So if you go hunting deer, the deer is your game. If you go hunting turkey, turkey is your game. So, let's talk about one of the things, guys, that English nobles kind of tried to do to stick it to any burghers or bourgeoisie or middle-class people that were trying to get into nobility. They'd be like, oh, okay, well, you may be able to buy a title, but you know what you can't do? You can't go hunting, all right? So basically, they passed these laws in the English Parliament that only nobles who owned land could hunt animals, all right? It's kind of a way to stick it to the, like I said, the middle-class people, all right? Like, hey, you may have money, but you know what you can't do? You don't own land, and you can't hunt on land because you're not a real noble. So one of the ways, like I said, they tried to fight back against these lower class people trying to buy their way into nobility is by passing laws that prohibited them from hunting game, if that makes sense. Now, they hunted guys to eat. For some reason, guys, I don't know why I threw this in there, but peasants did not eat much meat. Oh yeah, guys, let's talk about the diet of peasants. Basically, bread, grains, and bread. And you might mix some hot water and throw some, wheat in that and make some kind of nasty, floury gruel. It's not very good. We call it oatmeal. They might eat oatmeal, guys, or oats, but that's kind of what they consisted of, grains. They didn't eat meat. It was pretty much a noble thing. Oh, look, we killed a hog. Let's roast it up. Okay? So yeah, guys, bread is very important to a peasant, and one of the things you're going to see in a lot of revolutions is riots over bread. And you might think, who gives a crap about bread? Well, peasants do because it's what they eat. Bread and water. Pretty delicious, yeah? Pause if you need to. Oh, wait, one more thing, sorry. Some peasants poached, which means they illegally hunted. They might sneak onto a lord's land, and they might try to kill something and, take it home and cook it. I'm pretty sure, though, don't quote me on this because I haven't looked it up, but I'm pretty sure if you got caught poaching on the king's land, that was a crime punishable by death. So, you must be pretty hungry if you're trying to poach. All right, pause if you need to. All right, we're almost done here. Peasant families. Let's see how we're looking on time. All right, not bad. Ooh. All right, peasant families. All right, roll. Work, survival. That's what they did. All right. If you're a family, you worked and you tried to survive. If you're an artisan, you might try to teach your children a trade, okay? Like, let's say you're a carpenter. You might be able to teach your kid a carpenter so that they can become a carpenter when they get older, all right? Usually, peasant families consisted of a mother, father, and, like, multiple children. Remember, birth control was kind of frowned upon at the time, and it wasn't very effective, right? Remember, we talked about this? I'm not going to get awkward. We're just going to move on. Okay. All right. Now, usually they relied on the work of the father. Marriage was necessary. So let's say because women can't get jobs that men can do and women aren't paid very much, basically the male was the provider. So let's say if dad died, mom usually went and remarried another dude just because she needed financial support. So if you're a woman without a husband, you are going to struggle because you're not going to make very much money because no one's going to hire you because you're a woman. All right. No formal education. Peasants didn't go to school. They worked and they did more work. So it wasn't like, today where, people of all classes go to school. All right. Women, like I said, they relied on males' work or income. A female might learn a trade. If they're in an artisan family, think about Maria Winkelmann. Her husband was an astronomer, so she learned the trade of astronomy and making calendars. That was possible if there was no son to pass on that trade to. But for most part, women, are pretty much going to rely on men's income. And they did traditional domestic jobs, all right? Domestic, which means work at home, take care of the kids, all that stuff, right? Okay. All right, guys, I'm sorry. I know I ran through that last slide, but I'm trying to cut it short because I've already kept you way too long. You guys have a good night.